Psychology has long relied on a simple assumption. There is a clean, biological border separating you from everything else. The I is inside the skin, the other is outside. But this rigid model is incorrect. If identity ends at the skin, we cannot explain why systemic violence against strangers feels entirely different from harm to a relative, or why certain nightmares paralyze us after waking. Continuity theory offers a different premise. Identity is not a fixed border. It is a continuous, vibrating gradient of attachment that stretches outward from the physical body. At the center is the first-hand I, the immediate, embodied biological self. Everything beyond that, family, community, ideology, nation, forms the second-hand I, a series of extended, abstract selves. This equation governs the structure. The I is not a point in space, but a mathematical integration field. Your identity's boundary is dictated by two variables: coupling strength, C, to an external node, and emotional weight, M. When these variables increase, your self boundary expands. Every cognitive process, from choosing a political affiliation to feeling panic, is the brain calculating safety risk across this fluctuating field. Because identity operates as an elastic field rather than a solid wall, it can be stretched, and stretching it too far mathematically generates the severe structural instabilities we register as psychological horror. To understand those instabilities, we have to map the specific scales of this identity field, moving outward from the first-hand I. This diagram maps the 6 levels of our multi-scale identity structure. At the base, scale 1, is the biological body. The field scales upward through the child and intimate extensions into the family, the tribe, the nation, and finally reaches scale 6, humanity and pure ideology. The center of gravity for human decision-making is the balancing axis. Depending on the context and the immediate strain, this axis slides up and down these 6 layers. Continuity theory reveals a central paradox in this movement. As the balancing axis moves higher into the abstract second-hand I, it gains massive symbolic meaning, but it loses direct sensory grounding. To prevent these higher abstract identities from collapsing, the brain has to invent heavy narrative machinery, myths, doctrines, and laws, to artificially stabilize them. Relying on this artificial machinery forces the mind to constantly manage internal contradictions between what the body feels and what the ideology demands. Expanding human identity is a high-friction process. Embracing grand ideologies mathematically guarantees a degradation of the relaxed mind. We can calculate the exact psychological toll of maintaining a second-hand I. This is the internal complication formula. It establishes the specific multipliers of cognitive friction. Distance represents how far the balancing axis has migrated from biological self-preservation. Abstraction and suppression measure the cognitive energy required to silence basic biological empathy in order to serve a higher ideological law. When the system moves too far into the second-hand I, the person splits into competing centers. The body feels distress, while the ideology commands obedience. A healthy mind maintains a balancing axis that extends outward, but remains firmly anchored to direct felt empathy. When the balancing axis is pushed entirely into the abstract, stripped of biological grounding, the system becomes primed for extreme, pathologically justified violence. This brings us to the most extreme structural anomaly in continuity theory: the historical reality of societies sacrificing their own children for an ideology. In the ancient Mediterranean, the Carthaginian Tophets provided a documented archaeological record where the second-hand I demanded biological sacrifice. High in the Andes, the Inca Capacocha rituals exacted a similar toll. This cognitive override is a universal phase state of the human brain, not an isolated cultural fluke. These acts are not driven by a lack of identity. They are driven by a mechanical error called axis capture. Watch this collision. The symbolic order axis, the deity or state at level 6, forcefully reaches down and engulfs the embodied care axis at level 2, severing the biological link. The child is violently pulled out of the protected extended self zone and reclassified as a transactional token for the tribe's survival. The mechanism of moral disengagement allows the perpetrator to view this destruction as a righteous duty rather than a biological horror. Harming a child generates maximum symbolic currency for the ideology because it requires the ultimate, most difficult suppression of the first-hand I. Atrocities do not require monsters. They simply require the second-hand I to claim the absolute mathematical right to override the first-hand I. This same boundary failure happens internally every night. Our brains subconsciously simulate these exact ruptures while we sleep. Dreams are not mystical visions. They are compressed biological stress tests of I-other boundary instability. This is the Brain Kinematics Model, or BKM, phase diagram. It plots these states in 3 dimensions. The x-axis measures coupling from 0 to 10. The y-axis measures threat, and the z-axis measures the scale of the identity field. Within this space, safe integration sits near the origin. Pushing the boundaries outward reveals extreme regions, where the field flips into overfusion, dissolution, and betrayal. We can calculate the exact severity of a nightmare using the instability index equation. A dream about a physical attack, a simple penetration of the bodily boundary, scores a moderate 6.8 on this index. Contrast that with a dream about a child in danger. That scenario scores a perfect 10.0 because it combines maximum threat with maximum coupling. The mathematics of BKM prove that our deepest subconscious terrors are not monsters in the dark. They are the structural ruptures of our most highly coupled extended selves. If dreams are biological simulations of boundary strain, then cultural storytelling and literature are the conscious, expanded versions of this exact same system. We can use Stephen King's The Bazaar of Bad Dreams not as a fiction collection, but as a quantifiable dataset of cognitive strain templates. This scatterplot maps the 20 stories onto the BKM phase diagram, analyzing metrics like threat intensity, guilt load, and mortality load. The data reveals high empirical averages, a 6.7 out of 10 for threat intensity and a massive 7.8 for mortality load. This forms a unified thematic cluster. Instead of simple jump scares, they rely on mortality strain, moral contamination, and the uncanny inversion of the first-hand I. Stories involving deep moral compromise map identically to the BKM category of guilt dreams, functioning as pure contamination strain. King's apocalyptic stories score identically to the dissolution region of the BKM phase diagram, representing a total scale 6 collapse. Elite horror literature is effective because it bypasses narrative tropes and directly manipulates the exact mathematical variables of our cognitive safety risk fields. Archaeological atrocities, subconscious nightmares, and horror literature all point to the same structural truth. As identity stretches away from the physical body to gain symbolic power, it inherently breeds internal conflict. A failure to anchor our grandest ideologies to our basic biological empathy results in systemic psychological and societal collapse. Whether we are sleeping, reading, or building civilizations, the underlying mechanism is identical. Human consciousness is nothing more than the continuous, desperate rebalancing of safety risk across a multi-scale architecture of identity.